friends, and welcome back to part 2 of me talking about my favourite children's books of 2022. I'm a children's bookseller, so that means I read lots of kids' books and I have lots of opinions on them. So I did recently post a video about my favourite junior fiction that I read in 2022. This video will be about my favourite middle fiction of 2022, and very soon will be coming my favourite YA, or young adult, of the year. As with before, there are other books that I love to recommend to kids that I've read and have enjoyed, but the books that I'm talking about in these videos, like I, as a reader, just particularly fell in love with. Basically, these are my personal faves of the year. And I love talking about children's books, but these videos never do very well with the algorithm. So if you do enjoy this video, I would love it if you could like and leave me a comment down below. And if there's anyone in your life that you think might enjoy this video, please share it with them as well. But without further ado, let's get to talking about some incredible middle grade books. And these are in no particular order. Let's dive right in. So the first book that I pulled off the shelf is my favorite middle grade book of the year. In fact, it's my favorite middle fiction that I've ever read. I loved it so hard, and that is The Lost Roux by Emi Watanabe-Cohen. This is a bit of a magical realism or very low level fantasy story that's also kind of like an alternative history of 1960s Japan. And basically in this book, dragons used to exist. People in Japan used to have big, massive dragons, you know, the kind of dragons that we think of when we think of dragons. But after World War II, all of those big dragons disappeared. And now people do still have dragons, but they're tiny dragons that fit in the palm of their hand. Kohei is our main character. He's a young boy who lives at home with his mum and his grandfather. His mum is very emotionally detached, and his grandfather is quite an angry kind of man. It seems like he might have some kind of PTSD from the war. And he's often talking about how he misses the days when Japan had big dragons. Then one day, a Jewish-Japanese family who have been living in America move into Kohei's neighborhood. And they have a daughter who's about the same age named Isolde. And Kohei is really excited about meeting this American family because he's heard that Americans still have big dragons. And he believes that if he can just show his grandfather a big dragon, maybe he'll be happy again. But when this family moves in, it becomes very obvious very quickly that they don't have some big American dragon. Instead, they also have a small dragon, and he speaks Yiddish. And then basically some more stuff happens, and these two kids, Kohei and Isolde, go on this big quest to try and find big dragons, and they end up under the ocean and in this magical realm, and they learn about the history of Japan and also Kohei's family. This is one of those books that is so rich with metaphor and analogy that you could just talk about all day, and I want to. It's that kind of book. Essentially, without getting into it too much, and I'm sure you've probably already gathered, the dragons are essentially some kind of allegory for national pride, I think anyway, and national identity, especially in the wake of so much loss and heartbreak of World War II. So basically this is a story about intergenerational trauma and the effects of World War II, the lingering effects on people and families. It's also about national identity and national pride, as well as forgiveness and the fact that forgiveness is a choice. I was gripped from beginning to end. The writing in this is gorgeous. As I said, the metaphors and the allegories are just so well done. It's still such a good story, but the messages are so powerful too. Like, it's one of those stories that it doesn't sacrifice the narrative to make a point, but it makes its point so beautifully. It is a heartbreaking, moving story, but at the center of it, it's also very empowering too. It's just incredible. I loved it so hard, and like I said, it is now my favorite middle grade book that I've ever read. I read this in one sitting. I was so enthralled, like with the narrative, but also emotionally. I was so invested. Kohei and his journey is definitely a story that will just stay with me forever. I loved it. Next up for something a little bit more fun is Wheeler, the Kuri Warrior by Jordan Gould and Richard Pritchard. This book is called Guardians, and I think it's going to be the first in a new series. This is an historical fantasy kind of story set in Australia 40,000 years ago when megafauna still roamed the continent. In this book, we meet Wheeler, who is a young girl who loves art, when one day a bunch of dragons come and attack her tribe and like captures most of the people in her tribe. When Wheeler returns to discover what has happened, her grandmother is one of the few people remaining and she's dying. And so Wheeler runs up to her, and her grandmother lets her know that she, Wheeler, needs to become the next Kuri warrior to save her people. So it is about Wheeler, this strong but very sensitive and thoughtful girl, having to figure out how to use her strengths and be brave. And what she needs to do is to go to neighboring tribes and to sort of win the approval of the neighboring guardians, which are these kind of magical megafauna creatures, and bring them together so that collectively they can help save Wheeler's tribe. There's some really cool illustrations throughout, and there's also some great opportunities for education throughout as well. There's often like little footnotes at the bottom, either just to give you some pronunciation help or to like tell you a little bit about maybe some food or some art or something. There's even a very helpful glossary at the back. This is just a thrilling adventure story, and it's quite light-hearted, and there's plenty of humor throughout as well. And there is a lot of really solid character development, especially for Wheeler. And of course, the representation of having a protagonist like Wheeler, like front and center in such a popular book in Australia at the moment, is also really exciting. Next up, I wanted to talk about The Wild Robot by Peter Brown. In this story, we meet a robot named Roz, who basically just like wakes up on an island. She has no idea how she got there or what's going on, but she knows she just needs to figure out how to survive. At first, all of the animals on this isolated island are quite scared of her and they call her a monster. But as Roz sort of settles into the island and figures out what's going on, she observes the animals and she starts to like help them out a little bit. And she also learns how to speak their language. And so it's just this really cute story about this robot helping animals out and making friends. Like, it's adorable. There are some really cute illustrations throughout as well, which I actually thought were done by John Klassen, but they're by Peter Brown as well, the author. This is just really charming. I love the character of Roz and all of the little escapades that she gets up to. And of course, watching her make friends with all of these animals is just adorable. That's not to say this book is without stakes. There definitely are stakes, especially towards the end. But overall, this is just such a good time. And so much of this book is spent watching Roz just like figure stuff out. And so in that way, it almost feels like slice of life and a little bit cozy. I don't know. I just loved this. It was so fun to read. Next, we have Amari and the Great Game by B.B. Alston. And this is the second book in this Supernatural Investigator series, I think, which the first one obviously started with Amari and the Night Brothers. I actually did read Amari and the Night Brothers as well this year, but as you'll know, I didn't love that book. I really liked it and I felt like there was so much potential there. And I was definitely keen to see where B.B. Alston was going to take it in book 2. And I was so happy to say that I loved book 2. To me, this is such a big step up from book 1. It took all of that promise and potential that I felt in book 1 and just refined the prose and the pacing and all of that stuff to make a much more compelling and effective read, I felt. I won't talk too much about the plot of this because I don't want to spoil anything for those of you who haven't read book 1 yet, but I will just say that Amari is one of my favorite characters in middle fiction. She's so fun to read and to root for. She's just such a wonderful character. She's one of those characters that feels like a really solid role model without being too perfect. It's just a great balance. Anyway, along with things like Nevermore, this is quickly becoming a middle grade sort of like magical child story that I cannot help but recommend to anyone who walks into the store asking for something along those lines. And I absolutely cannot wait for book 3. Now, this one is not a magical child story, but it is set in a fantasy realm, and that is Neura and the Immortal Palace. This copy is just a proof. The actual cover is a little bit more intricate, but I really enjoyed this, and Neura is another middle grade character that I just fell in love with. This is also a story that is rooted in Muslim tradition, and our main characters are Muslim, so there's some great representation there too. And there's also some absolutely incredible commentary about like capitalism and exploitation as well. Anyway, this is a story about Neura, who lives at home with her mum and her siblings, and they're very poor. So Neura is the eldest of her siblings, and so she's decided to leave school and to start working in the mica mines to help make money for their family to survive. She misses school and she's sad that she's not getting an education, but she hopes that her sacrifice will mean that her younger siblings get opportunities that she never had. One day, the kids are sort of like digging deeper and deeper in the mine to find the mica, and some stuff happens and basically they dig too deep and they end up going through to this portal realm of the jinn. And Neura has always been told that the jinn are tricksters and are not to be trusted, and so to end up in a world of the jinn, it's very confusing and there's a lot going on. Anyway, these kids basically end up at the Immortal Palace, which is the palace where the jinn go, and there's like kind of this big party happening. And I don't want to spoil any more than that, but the setting of the palace is just so alive and magical and vivid to read. I love that we were reading about a normal kid, like not a magical kid. So many middle grade stories at the moment, as much as I love them, they're about like the chosen one kind of trope, which is fine. It was nice to get a story about a kid who just kind of like happened to end up in a magical realm and needed to get home. As I said, there's some incredible commentary around, I think, anti-capitalism and exploitation, but also around the importance of solidarity and how working together against our oppressors is the only way to liberation. Like, that's essentially a big part of this story, and it's incredible. I loved this. To me, this is definitely an underrated gem in middle fiction this year. Next up, we have A Glass House of Stars by Shirley Ma. Now, this was actually released last year, but I read it for the Readings Children's Prize shortlist video, which I'll leave a link to in the cards for you if you like. But I have also read Shirley Ma's other book that she did release this year, which was All Four Quarters of the Moon. And honestly, that could have added to this list as well. but I do think I slightly preferred A Glass House of Stars. They are quite similar in a lot of ways in terms of the themes that they explore and the atmosphere that they invoke. So if you like one, I think you can pretty reliably trust that you'll like the other. Anyway, this is a story about a family who immigrate to Australia in order to hopefully have a better life for their 2 daughters. But when they arrive, things are really hard for this family. Not only are they dealing with like explicit racism from teachers and neighbors, and then tragedy also befalls this family as well. And the protagonist, Mei Zing, who is the eldest daughter in this family, she really struggles with finding a balance between like her own sense of independence and identity and her responsibility to her family. And she just feels an awful lot of pressure from all sides, basically. This story also has a little bit of magical realism. It's sort of like in the imagination or the experience of Mei Zing, in that the house that they live in sort of feels alive to her. And the glass house, the old busted up, broken down glass house out the back in particular, is a place of magic and imagination for her. It's a heartbreaking and absolutely beautiful story, and the friendships that are developed in this are just gorgeous. They're some of the most beautiful, supportive, understanding, compassionate friendships I've read in middle grade this year. And Shirley Ma's writing is just divine. It's the perfect level of emotive and descriptive while still having such like a clear through narrative. Both of her books are just gorgeous, and this one in particular stole my heart. Next up, we have my most recent read. I finished this yesterday actually, so it was a late addition to this list, but this is Waiting for the Storks by Katrina Nannerstead. Katrina Nannerstead is a very well-known Australian author. She kind of has, it's a series, but it's not like a series that you have to read in order. They're just kind of like a collected theme of stories. I think this is the 4th, in which she explores different children's experiences through war. And I had never read any of them before, but recently Katrina came in to sign some of her books of her new release, which is this one, and I decided I needed to get on that and finally read my first Katrina Nannerstead, and what an experience it was. I can totally see why kids absolutely love these stories. They're educational about a really important part of history, but they're also just such beautiful, heartwarming stories. Well, this one was anyway, and I'm assuming the others were too. This one in particular was about a part of World War II that I did not know about. So I learned an awful lot. And basically this book tells the story of a program that the Nazis employed against Polish people. And I don't know all of the details and all of the specifics and like the correct language around all of this, but basically from what I understand, they took blonde-haired, blue-eyed Polish children away from their families and Germanized them. They essentially considered them lost Germans, lost Aryans, and so they stole these children away from their families and made them learn German and basically like brainwashed them into believing that they were German. And then for some of them who were Aryan enough, they adopted them out to German families. Anyway, in this story, we are introduced to an 8-year-old girl named Zofia. She lives in Poland during the war, and her father is a tailor and her mum is an academic. Obviously, the Polish people are struggling a lot at this time, but she just has such a happy home life and is absolutely loved and adored by her family. And then one day, an SS officer notices her blonde hair and her blue eyes, and so a couple of days later, a truck arrives and takes Zofia from her family. And so we watch as she goes through this Germanization process, how dehumanizing it is, and the choices that she has to make to survive, and how horrible those choices are that no child should have to make. And in order to survive this horrendous ordeal, her mind slowly begins to repress her Polish identity. So this was just a really powerful read. It definitely felt accessible and appropriate for kids, I'd say 10 plus, but it also walked that really careful line of not under-explaining things or making things nicer than they really were. I also really appreciated the author's note at the back. It was pretty substantial for an author's note, especially in a children's book, where Katrina spoke about the research that she did for this book and why she decided to write it. And she also spoke about how most children's experiences were either similar or different from Zofia's experience of this Germanization process, and just the effects that it had on so many Polish people, whether they survived this or not, like the trauma that was left. I just felt like this was really well done and totally moving. As you can tell, I'm getting a bit emotional just thinking about it. Again, like I said, it's a very recent read, so very raw, and has definitely left me wanting to go back and read some of her other ones as well. All right, now for something fun. This is The Dangerous Business of Being Trilby Moffett by Kate Temple. This is pretty much my go-to adventure fantasy recommendation for kids at the moment. I absolutely ate this up. This was such a quick read for me. I loved it. It is a little bit quirky and a little bit unusual, so sometimes it can be a bit hard to explain the plot. And also I want to be careful not to over-explain because there's just some really fun reveals throughout as well. But basically in this world, unusual things are happening, and there is this mysterious illness that is making people speak languages that don't even exist anymore. And once this illness progresses, basically these people become really tired and they start sleeping for long periods of time, and eventually they just don't wake up at all. At the beginning of the book, we find out that Trilby's mum has just contracted this disease, and so they're making their way to like sort of a lost relative's house, and it turns out this lost relative is actually like a great aunt who turns out to be 300 years old and secretly the keeper of time. She lives in this quirky little antique shop in the middle of nowhere that actually rests on the edge of time itself. Anyway, some weird stuff happens, and basically Trilby has to go into this realm where time doesn't exist and go to this island and try and figure out how to put things back in the right time to save herself and also her mother. The narration just has so much personality. It's just so fun to read. On top of that, there's a bit of like a fun word game that you can play with the chapter titles. So it's a very quick read and just a whole lot of fun. The next book I want to talk about is another underrated fantasy gem in middle fiction this year, and that is Onyeka. Now this is a proof cover. The actual cover is a little bit different, although I think this is glorious. I've heard this book described as having strong X-Men vibes. Now I've never watched anything X-Men, but like from what I can gather, I feel like that's pretty accurate. Onyeka feels more superhero than she does magical child, a la Morrigan Crow or Harry Potter. Basically, in this story, we're introduced to a young girl named Onyeka who it turns out she has magical hair. Her hair has magical powers. It's something that she didn't know about her hair until her best friend was drowning in the local pool, and her hair just kind of like saved her. But it turns out that this is a secret her mother knew about, because Onyeka's father, who is not in the picture anymore, was also magical. So Onyeka's mum quickly arranges for her and Onyeka to fly from England back to Nigeria, where they're from originally, in hopes of finding Onyeka's father and also learning more about Onyeka's powers. Because there's basically like this Nigerian X-Men school thing there. But it turns out there's a whole lot more going on and some shady business, and nobody knows where Onyeka's father is. So it's a good, fun, magical child kind of story, but it's not like a portal fantasy where they end off in some like magical world of witches and stuff. Instead, it feels very contemporary, and it feels, like I said, more superhero vibes. It's really fun, and there's also a good solid mystery too. Like I said, totally underrated middle fiction this year. I loved it, and I'm really looking forward to book 2. Next up, we have The Bookseller's Apprentice by Amelia Mellor. This is actually the prequel to another book that came out, I think it was last year or maybe it was the year before, which was The Grandest Bookshop in the World. I haven't actually read that first book, but the great thing is you don't need to read them in any particular order. I have heard great things about that first book though, so I do want to read it, especially after how much I enjoyed this one. This series is set in the late 1800s here in Melbourne, so it's historical fiction, but it also has a magical twist. It's set in places and a bookstall in particular that actually did exist, and it features characters that were real people. In this book, we're introduced to 12-year-old Billy Pike, who lives at home with his family, who are struggling a little bit financially. And now that he is 12 years old, his parents expect him to leave school and to get a job. And at first they suggest that maybe he could get a job doing the same thing that his father does, but his father's miserable and it's a really hard job, so he doesn't really want to do that. So instead he decides to go and find himself a job on his own. And he puts his resume in at the local bookstore at Paddy's Market. Mr. Cole, the gentleman who runs the bookstall, really likes Billy, and so he takes him on. There, Billy makes a new friend called Kezia, and also meets a mysterious gentleman who is an obscurasmith. He's a weird guy who's always prancing around wearing a top hat, and he's always making promises. He basically convinces people to enter into these weird contracts where he promises that he can give them something, anything they wish for. But he's one of those trickster characters that does technically fulfill his promises, but the cost is usually something pretty dire. He gets you on the wording, you know? And some terrible things start happening in the market, but Billy is onto this obscurasmith and he knows it's his fault. So he decides it's up to him to challenge this obscurasmith and save Paddy's Market. So they end up in this like magical trial against each other that's a race against time and also full of riddles and mysteries. And there are actually riddles throughout the book which you can try and solve along with Billy. And overall, this is just so well written. It's so well paced, so fun to read. The characters are dynamic and interesting. And this was just an utter delight. It's so charming, and especially being a Melburnian, it was just so fun to read about like people running up Burke Street. And Amelia talks about in the author's note at the back how much research she did for this and like how, you know, these people were real people and she wanted to bring their story to life. And I will be reading The Grandest Bookshop in the World because this was just so special. Okay, our last book before we get to the graphic novels was also a very recent read for me, and that is No Words. This is a pretty short book and it deals with a pretty sensitive topic, but it also handles it in a pretty light-hearted and uplifting way. Our main two protagonists are Hero, who is a young girl living in Australia who often feels like her name Hero is a bit too much pressure. She becomes very good friends with the new boy at school, Arya, who turns out to be a refugee from Iran. Arya seems to be like a sweet kid, but he's being bullied by the school bully, Rufus, and he also hasn't spoken a single word. Hero really likes Arya, but obviously she wishes she knew more about him. And then one day, she finds out that he's actually won a poetry competition. It turns out that Arya, the boy who never speaks, is a poet. So it's a beautiful story about friendship and about trauma that is explored in a very heartfelt and honest way. But as I said, there's an awful lot of humor and there's just like a light-hearted feeling about this entire book. So I think it's incredibly accessible to children, and I just personally found it beautiful. There are some flashback scenes of Arya's memories of Iran and also of fleeing Iran, which are pretty heavy and pretty intense. But I do feel like all of that is tackled really, really well, and as I said, balanced by the overall tone of this book being a really optimistic, hopeful, loving one. I just loved this. Both Hero and Arya wormed their way into my heart. I adored them both. I loved this. I think this is a really special and important middle fiction story that came out this year. All right, now quickly on to the graphic novels. The first is, of course, book 2 of Lightfall. This has cemented Lightfall as one of my favorite graphic novel series. I just love this thing. I love the way that Tim Probert uses panels and spacing and lighting. And of course, this story. This story is just so good. I don't want to talk too much about the plot of this one because I don't want to spoil what happens in book 1, but it's basically an adventure story with a beautiful, beautiful friendship between Bee and Cad at the absolute heart of it all. And in this book, they're basically on a quest to save the world, and they make an awful lot of mistakes along the way. I've said it before and I'll say it again. One of my favorite things about Lightfall is the representation, like the visual, artistic representation of Bee's anxiety. Lightfall is just glorious. It's popular for a reason. The only problem with it is that it takes so long for us to get new volumes. I want volume 3 yesterday. And then a new favorite for me this year was the Tea Dragon Society. Now, you don't have to get this ridiculously massive box set of the hardcovers like I did. This does come in much more manageable small paperback editions, but basically this is just a cozy, adorable fantasy story set in a world where dragons exist, except most of them are tiny and on their heads they grow tea leaves that you can like pick off and drink. And when you drink the tea of a tea dragon, you share its memories. It's just so cute. Like, this is wholesome, adorable goodness. And the characters in this are wonderful and delightfully diverse as well. This is enchanting, it's cozy, it's charming, it's just delightful. I cried when reading this, not only because I just found it so heartwarming and moving, but also just because it was so cute. Do you ever cry just because things are adorable? I do. And this made me do that. All right, so those are my favorite middle fiction titles of 2022. Obviously not all of these came out in 2022, but I did read them all this year. And you can probably tell that there's quite a few more middle fiction titles than I had junior fiction. Middle fiction is my favorite sort of category in the children's store. And it was hard for me to whittle this down to just like the 12 or 13 books that I did speak about today. There was another 5 or 6 that very nearly made it in, but I felt like that was getting a little bit excessive. Such is my enthusiasm for middle fiction. Anyway, I would love to hear in the comments below if you really loved any middle fiction this year that you would recommend. Alternatively, I would love to hear if you decide to pick up any of these books based on my recommendation, and come back and let me know how you found it after you finish reading it. As always, I have to say a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, especially to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie for their very generous support. And thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will talk to you in the comments and in the next video. Until then, happy reading. Bye.